There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix. A silence que vive dentro, mesmo quando há barulho ao redor. It's the quiet fatigue of a person who has done everything right, met deadlines, kept commitments, held things together, and yet feels like something inside remains deeply off-center. Perhaps you know this cansaço, the one that doesn't scream, but weighs, a subtle tension that lives behind your eyes and beneath your skin. And still, the world sees someone functioning, someone free. But what if freedom isn't what you thought? Not a loud explosion of emotion or a wild pursuit of passions, but a quiet return to yourself. Freedom, real freedom, is not the absence of difficulty. It is the absence of slavery to what happens within you when no one is watching. It's not about escaping pain, but about no longer being ruled by your impulses, your unexamined expectations, or the noise in your own mind. So many people walk through life with invisible chains. They smile at the right times. They nod, comply, perform. Yet inside they're pulled in every direction by what they haven't processed. Guilt that lingers, anger denied, the fear of being irrelevant, unloved, unseen. They've mistaken emotional intensity, tears, outbursts, adrenaline, for real connection with the self. They think feeling everything is depth, when often it is just chaos. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And Viktor Frankl echoed this truth from a darker place, a concentration camp, where he discovered that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. In that choice lies our growth and our freedom. But perhaps no one told you that silence is also a choice, that not reacting can be an act of immense power, that peace isn't always pleasant. Sometimes it's just the absence of noise. Imagine for a moment a man sitting alone in a locked cell. He's tired, resentful, worn. The door has no guards. He's free to leave, but in his pocket, unnoticed, are the keys. Still, he doesn't check. He assumes the lock is unbreakable, so he stays, angry, trapped, numb. That man isn't a metaphor. He's a reflection, a mirror. Many of us live like that, confined not by circumstances, but by the patterns we never questioned, repeating emotional habits so deeply ingrained, they feel like truth. Maybe you've been carrying those keys without realizing. This isn't about fixing yourself, it's about stopping and seeing, because what holds you isn't always outside. Sometimes it's just the voice inside you that no longer serves your becoming. And the way out begins not with force, but with clarity. Freedom isn't intensity, it's alignment, a quiet return to who you are, beneath the layers, the noise, the defense. And maybe today begins with silence. There is a kind of suffering that doesn't cry out. It lives em silêncio, nas dobras da resistência interna. It's the quiet agony of someone who fights, not against the world, but against what has already happened. A word dito que não pode ser retirado. A ausência de quem não volta mais. Uma escolha feita que já não se desfaz. Many carry this resistance as if it were a form of strength, when in truth, it is often a form of bondage. We imagine that accepting something painful is the same as surrendering, as giving up. But acceptance, true acceptance, is not a retreat. It's a refusal to keep feeding a wound with illusion. It is the quiet decision to stop rowing against the current with the rudder locked in reverse. It's realizing that some rivers cannot be reversed, and some moments can only be met, not changed. The Stoics called it amor fati, the love of fate. Not a romantic love, but a deep agreement with reality, even when it doesn't please us. To say, this is what is. Now, what will I do with it? Without this posture, we live in a loop of inattention. Resistance doesn't stay in the mind. It sinks into the body. It tightens your shoulders, shortens your breath, steals your sleep. What we resist persists. Have you ever noticed how much energy is lost trying to change what's already occurred? How many thoughts revisit an old betrayal, a missed opportunity, a word you wish you hadn't said? It doesn't feel like suffering at first. It feels like thinking, analyzing, processing, but over time it becomes weight. To accept isn't to approve. It's to end the war within. It's to stop trying to rewrite a chapter that has already been printed. Acceptance breaks the loop. It opens a new direction, one that is rooted in lucidez and not in denial. Maybe that's why the pain doesn't leave, because part of you still believes you can rewrite what has already become passado. But what if peace begins not with a solution, but with a sentence quietly said to yourself, "This happened, and I will no longer resist it." Not everything is meant to be fixed. Some things are meant to be integrated, to be lived com dignidade, like someone finally letting go of the oars and watching as the river carries them to a shore they never imagined, but were always heading toward. And in that stillness, control returns, not over the world, but over how you meet it. Some feelings arrive without permission. A sudden heat in the chest, a tightening in the stomach, a weight in the throat that you can't quite name. And in those moments, something inside whispers, "This must be true. This feeling must mean something absolute." But what if emotions don't lie, and yet your interpretation of them does? You see, emotions are real. They are messengers, signals. They emerge before thought, before analysis. The body speaks through them. But the mind writes the story. And that story is not always accurate. The problem isn't that you feel, it's what you tell yourself that feeling means. Neuroscience has shown us that the amygdala, that small almond-shaped structure in the brain, can react within milliseconds. A raised voice, a certain look, a familiar phrase. It pulls you into a state of alarm before reason even arrives. Suddenly, you're not just annoyed, you're under threat. Not just sad, but abandoned. The feeling is true, but the narrative may not be. Have you ever said to yourself, "I'm angry, so something must be wrong," and then spent hours trying to find what it is? Or felt hurt and assumed that someone meant to wound you? That is the interpretation. That's the distortion. And that's where suffering begins. The Stoics did not ask us to ignore our emotions. They asked us to see them with clarity, to pause before turning them into identity. Epictetus would teach his students to say, "There is anger here," instead of "I am angry." That shift in language is not small. It creates space. Space between you and the flame. Because when you are the emotion, it owns you. But when you observe the emotion, you begin to regain your center. The difference is subtle yet powerful, like watching a storm through a window instead of being caught in the rain. Many of us were taught to suppress or to explode, to deny what we feel or to become possessed by it. But perhaps there is a quieter path, one where you acknowledge the fire without burning the house, where you name what arises, not to fight it, but to understand it. And in that understanding, something softens. You realize the feeling was never the enemy. The story you built around it was. To feel is human, but to respond with lucidez, that is freedom. Somewhere along the way, we were led to believe that our thoughts are sacred. That because a voice echoes in our mind, it must carry truth. But thoughts are not facts. They are habits, reflexes shaped by experience, trauma, repetition, and many of them were never chosen, only inherited. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds what we don't want to face. But what happens when that shadow begins to speak in the form of thoughts, quiet judgments, self-criticism, an endless loop of suspicion, fear, or doubt? If you listen long enough, you begin to think it's you, that this is just how your mind works, that this is who you are. But that's not the truth. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who notices them. There's a moment, often in the silence of early morning or late at night, when you become aware of how restless your mind can be. Thoughts about something you said years ago. Imagined scenarios that will never happen. 1,000 mental rehearsals for conversations that may never exist. And in that flood, you might forget that you have a choice. Not to control every thought, but to stop believing every one of them. The Stoics knew this. They would sit and write down their mental patterns, not to fix them, but to see them clearly. Because naming the pattern is the first step to dissolving its power. To notice when your mind says, "I'm not good enough," and instead of arguing or agreeing, you simply pause and say, "Ah, that's the old script, still running." That moment of observation, that is the space where freedom begins. When you stop identifying with the thought, it starts to lose its grip. You no longer need to silence it. You simply stop feeding it, like a fire that dies, not because you fight it, but because you stop adding wood. Think of it this way. If every thought were a cloud, some dark, some light, then you are not the cloud. You are the sky, vast, intact, unmoved, and maybe that's the shift. From being inside the storm to watching it pass. Your mind will continue to speak, it always will, but your freedom lies not in changing every word. It lies in no longer mistaking the voice for truth. And when that happens, something inside you stands still, clear, quiet, rooted, and finally unpresent. There is a strange kind of suffering that comes not from chaos, but from the desperate attempt to avoid it. A quiet exhaustion that builds in those who live in constant alertness, always calculating, always preparing, always watching for the next mistake, the next disappointment, the next sign of collapse. It feels like responsibility. It looks like high functioning. But beneath it is fear, the fear of losing control. It begins subtly, with the need to fix what others feel, to predict outcomes, to manage not only your world, but everyone else's. And then it consumes. You start anticipating every possible failure before it happens, planning conversations in your head, micromanaging your day to avoid emotional discomfort, until life becomes not something you live, but something you monitor. But what if the control you seek is not found in holding tighter, but in letting go? The Stoics knew this paradox well. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, faced wars and loss, and yet wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He did not call for passivity. He called for clarity, to discern what belongs to you and what never did. Anxiety is often the result of blurred lines, trying to control what is inherently uncontrollable, another person's choices, the outcome of an effort, the emotions of a loved one. And each attempt creates more tension, not less. Think of the man who builds his identity around achievement. He plans every detail, predicts every risk, controls every move. But one day, despite everything, the foundation cracks, and he loses what he built. At first it breaks him, then it frees him. Because in losing what he thought defined him, he discovered what cannot be taken, the quiet steadiness of being aligned with what is real. True control, then, is not about managing every outcome. It is about meeting each moment with presence rather than panic. It is knowing that uncertainty does not mean failure, that letting go is not giving up. It's trusting that your response is more powerful than the result. The Stoic trains for loss before it arrives, not to become cold but to become prepared, grounded, able to meet the storm without crumbling inside. And maybe that's the deeper strength, not the ability to dictate everything, but the quiet power to respond with lucidez, even when nothing goes as planned. Because in the end, peace does not come from control, it comes from coherence. From living in line with what you can influence, and releasing the rest like leaves carried by a river you no longer need to dam. There's a kind of pain that doesn't come from the original wound, but from all the ways we try not to feel it. The distractions, the workaholism, the endless scrolling, the carefully crafted routines that fill every hour, so that silence never has a chance to speak. We often think we're coping, functioning, moving on, but inside, something remains unresolved. Not because we are weak, but because we are scared. Not of the pain itself, but of what it might mean, of what it might awaken if we truly sat with it, even for a moment. This is the heart of evitasyon experiential, a psychological pattern where we try to escape discomfort at all costs. It seems logical: if something hurts, avoid it. But over time, this avoidance becomes the true source of suffering, not the wound, but the refusal to turn toward it. Imagine someone walking through shallow water who suddenly panics. He starts running, splashing, gasping, convinced he's drowning. But the water was never deep. The fear created the struggle. The reaction created the danger. And in trying to escape, he made the pain louder. The Stoics understood this human tendency. They taught not avoidance, but integration, to face what is unpleasant, not with force, but with firmeza, to acknowledge what hurts without needing to dramatize or repress it, to be still and let the wound breathe. Because the truth is, the pain doesn't ask to be solved. It asks to be seen. And once seen, really visto, sem fuga, it begins to lose its grip. We live in a culture that rewards sedation. Comfort is easy to access, but peace is not comfort. Peace often begins when we stop running, when we pause long enough to hear what's beneath the noise, when we no longer need to drown out the ache, but instead, we listen. And maybe what you find in that listening is not weakness, but força, the quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that doesn't depend on the absence of wounds, but on your willingness to carry them with dignidade, because what hurts is real, but what heals is presence. Not every wound is caused by cruelty. Sometimes it's caused by unmet expectations, by the quiet hope that someone would act differently, love more clearly, see you more deeply. And when they don't, not out of malice, but out of their own limitations, it feels like betrayal. But what if the pain is not in the person, but in what you attached to them? We are relational beings. We form bonds, we invest meaning, and often we project. We see not who the other is but who we need them to be. And when reality breaks the fantasy, it's not just disappointment, it feels like loss. But loss of what, exactly? Sometimes it's the loss of an illusion. The Stoics taught a clear distinction. There's the person, and there's your expectation of the person. Only one of these is yours to govern, the other is not. Think of someone who constantly overextends, giving more than they receive, always hoping that love will return in the same measure. But what they're really attached to is not the person, it's the idea of being needed, of being affirmed, of being seen. When that doesn't happen, it's not just sadness, it's identity collapse. Because they weren't just loving, they were trying to heal through someone else. Attachment is not love, it is the attempt to secure safety through control, through prediction, through consistency. But people are unpredictable, and your peace cannot be placed in hands that are not yours. Psychology calls this anxious attachment. Stoicism calls it misplaced control. The result is the same, suffering rooted in illusion. There's a practice, quiet, personal, of writing an internal carta. Not to be sent, not to demand anything, but to release. To name the projections you've placed on someone, to say, I release you from being who I hoped you would be. I see you now, not as I wished, but as you are. And in that release comes clarity, because no one truly owes you the version of themselves you created in your mind, and perhaps neither do you. The grief is real. The ache of letting go of an idealized connection is not small, but what you gain in return is coherence. A return to what is real, grounded, honest, and in that space love becomes lighter, less about possession and more about presenza, less about filling your emptiness and more about sharing your exo. There is a strange illusion we often carry, the sense of infinite time. We plan as if the calendar is endless. We postpone difficult conversations. We delay presence. We believe there will always be another moment to begin, to repair, to rest. But deep down, we know that's not true. Every breath is borrowed, every hour a quiet gift. Yet most live as if they are owed more, as if death is a distant stranger rather than a silent companion, always near, always watching, not with menace, but with reminder. The Stoics weren't obsessed with death. They were intimate with it. They practiced memento mori, not to be morbid, but to be awake, to remember that what is temporary becomes precious, that what can end must be honored. There is a particular kind of suffering that arises when we ignore our mortality. It's not loud. It shows up in indecision, in procrastination, in the quiet drift toward meaningless activity. It's the pain of realizing, too late, that you gave your best hours to what didn't matter, that you lived by urgency, not by importance. What if your time was not truly yours, but something on loan measured not by clocks but by clarity? A man can spend years climbing a ladder, only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. A woman can devote decades to maintaining appearances, stability, perfection, control, only to find herself alone with her image and far from her essence. But when you remember that time is not guaranteed, something changes. You stop asking, what do I have to do today, and begin asking, what deserves my presence? It's not about doing more. It's about doing the right things with your whole self, not what is urgent, but what is eterno. The conversation that has waited too long, the morning walk in silence, the decision you've postponed, not because it's difficult, but because it's meaningful. You are not running out of time. You are being invited to use it with reverence. To look at the day not as a checklist, but as a chance. To live in a way that if death came tonight, you would meet it not with regret, but with quiet readiness. Because the goal is not to live forever. It is to live aligned. And in that alignment, time stretches, moments deepen, and presence becomes enough. There's a comfort that soothes, and there's a comfort that numbs. Not all pleasure is wrong, but much of it, when unexamined, becomes a quiet escape, a gentle sedation that lulls us into forgetting what actually aches beneath the surface. We call it rest, we call it reward, but often it's just avoidance dressed in softness. The modern world has mastered the art of sedation, endless entertainment, food without hunger, connection without profundidade, and while each indulgence promises relief, what it often delivers is distance from ourselves, from truth, from clarity. Dopamine rewards novelty. It chases spikes, not meaning. It wants more, not depth, but peace. Peace is found not in stimulation, but in stillness, in serotonin, in the slow, rooted presence that comes not from escape, but from alignment. Have you noticed how easy it is to feel busy, even when doing nothing, to be filled with noise, even in silence? This is the mark of sedation. The body is still, but the soul is restless. The Stoics warned against the pursuit of pleasure as a goal, not because pleasure is bad, but because it is fleeting. It cannot carry the weight of meaning. Epictetus observed that what enslaves us is not what we enjoy, but what we believe we cannot live without. The moment a pleasure becomes a necessity, it begins to own you. Imagine a person who fills every evening with distraction, a drink, a series, a scroll. They aren't doing harm, they aren't out of control, but they are disconnected, not from the world, but from themselves. And over time, this gentle distance becomes a chasm. The days blur, the purpose fades, and peace, true grounded peace, becomes foreign. But nature teaches us something different. The silence of the mountain, the slow rhythm of a tree growing, the still water that reflects the sky. None of these are loud, none chase pleasure, yet they radiate something more enduring: presence, coherence, verdad. Perhaps that's the shift we need, from asking what will make me feel good now to asking what will sustain me when nothing feels good at all. Because pleasure is easy, but peace is earned, not through effort, but through presence, through the willingness to face the moment as it is, without needing to soften it with sedation. And in that space, something deeper is born. Not excitement, not stimulation, but a kind of quiet contentment that no pleasure can replace. A serenity that remains even when the noise fades. There is a silence that speaks more than noise ever could. A pause that isn't empty, but full, not of distraction, but of discernment. Yet in a world that equates movement with value and volume with truth, stillness is often misunderstood. It looks like doing nothing, but in truth it is a state of deep observation, a clarity that cannot be reached through haste. Mental noise isn't a sign of life. Often it's a symptom of disconnection from the self, from what matters, from the present. The racing thoughts, the unfinished dialogues in your mind, the constant scanning for threats or opportunities, all of it creates a kind of psychic disintegration. The soul begins to fragment, not because it's weak, but because it's overwhelmed. Epictetus spoke of silence not as absence, but as resposta. To not react immediately is not indifference. It's wisdom. It's the space where true understanding forms, before the defense, before the justification, before the need to prove. Imagine a moment in your day when you do nothing, not out of laziness, but by choice. No phone, no task, just presence, just breath. At first it feels useless, then uncomfortable, and finally something begins to settle. Your thoughts slow, your senses return. You begin to notice things, the tension in your shoulders, the rhythm of your breath, the sound of your own quiet longing. Stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the alignment of movement with meaning. It is when your actions are no longer impulsive, but coherent. When your words carry weight, not because they are loud, but because they come from a grounded place. Many avoid stillness because it mirrors them back to themselves. It reveals the noise they carry within. But this is the gift, because once seen, and that noise can be softened and eventually released. The Stoics didn't meditate in caves. They meditated in cities, in palaces, in the middle of conflict. Their stillness wasn't external, it was internal, a posture of non-reactivity, a decision to see before responding, to breathe before speaking, to wait and then choose. Perhaps this is what you're craving, not more time, not more stimulation, but a return to stillness, a kind of quiet that doesn't just soothe but reveals, a pause that recalibrates, a moment of being before doing, and in that space, you don't lose time, you find yourself. There's a common belief, often unspoken, that to live well, one must be healed. That until the wound closes, the path must wait. But life doesn't pause, and healing, as the Stoics understood, is not always a return to what was. Sometimes it is the art of walking forward with the wound still open. Pain does not disqualify you from clarity. It does not make you less capable of choosing with dignity. It simply makes you more human. The deeper question is not whether you hurt, but whether you can hold that pain without letting it distort your sense of self. Viktor Frankl, who endured suffering most cannot imagine, wrote that suffering does not remove meaning, it reveals it. In the depth of trauma, when all comforts fall away, what remains is essence, purpose, the quiet fire that cannot be extinguished, only hidden. Many carry their pain in silence, old betrayals, losses that never made sense, the weight of choices they can't undo. And in that silence, a new fear arises, that the wound has changed them irrevocably, that they will never be whole again. But perhaps wholeness isn't what you think. Perhaps it's not the absence of pain, but the presence of integrity, to walk even when you limp, to choose even when you doubt, to love even when you're afraid it might be lost again. The Stoics never promised immunity from pain. They offered a different kind of freedom, the ability to suffer, sem securvar, to carry what hurts with firmeza, not hiding it, not performing strength, but living in alignment even while bleeding. There's a story, not always told loudly, of a veteran who returned from war changed, not just physically, but emotionally. At first, he withdrew. Life felt foreign, but slowly he began to live again, not by erasing what he had seen, but by integrating it, by serving others, by finding strength not in forgetting, but in remembering with proposito. That is the way forward, not around the pain, not in spite of it, but through, with eyes open, with passos firmes, with the quiet courage to say, this wound is part of me, but it will not define how I stand, because the mark of someone truly strong is not how untouched they are, but how gracefully they carry what once tried to break them, and still choose to walk straight. There's a quiet truth that many carry, but few say out loud, the fear of being irreparably broken, of having something inside that cannot be repaired. But perhaps the issue is not brokenness. It is the absence of honest observation, of sitting with what is, gently, courageously, and seeing it for what it really is. You are not fragmented beyond repair. You are simply filled with rooms you have not yet entered, emotional habits you've never paused to question, scripts written long ago that you're still performing, without knowing why. The Stoic path was never about perfection. It was about lucidez, about the willingness to face yourself fully, without flinching, without running, not to fix, but to understand. Because what we understand no longer controls us. It becomes part of our story, not the whole of it. Freedom isn't found in the absence of pain, nor in the mastery of every emotion. It's found in the space between, the moment where you choose not to be ruled by what arises, but to respond with quiet clarity, to observe the anger, the fear, the doubt, and to remain still enough to ask, is this mine, or is this just a reflex? Perhaps that is where the strength lies, not in changing everything, but in noticing, questioning, choosing. Imagine a house where you've lived for years, but always in the same two rooms. One day you decide to open the others. Some are messy, some are empty, some hold memories you've tried to forget, but only by walking through them can you finally understand the home you've built within yourself. This is what it means to examine, not to judge, not to destroy, but to illuminate. You are not broken, you are unseen even by yourself, but now the light is on, and in that light you begin again. Not with force, not with urgency, but with coherence, with presenza, with the quiet, steady return to who you were always capable of becoming.